Good evening, my name is Andrew McKee and I'm a sophomore political science major from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Today I'm going to have the privilege of presenting to you a bit of research that I conducted on the Louisiana slave database. Now this database was initially composed by Gwendolyn Midlow Hall, and her primary objective in initiating this research and comprising the information that she was able to retrieve from archives nationally was to provide a bit of insight on the lives and the personal stories of slaves. In particular, there were 107,000 slaves that were documented in the slave database. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the variables that I decided to evaluate. My first variable that I decided to evaluate was the primary language that was spoken by the slaves. The next was the gender. The following was the primary racial demographic of the slaves. And next after that is the runaway status of the slaves, followed lastly by the skill groupings of the slaves. Now, so we begin with the language variable, and so initially my question became, what was the most prominent language that was spoken amongst the slaves throughout the course of 1719 through 1820? And what the database was able to provide to me was an answer that was French being the primary language that was spoken by these slaves. So in my methodology, what I like to do was evaluate my variables and then find this, enter that information into SPSS, produce a graph, and in evaluating the graph, come up with a descriptive discussion as well as an interpretive discussion of the findings that were produced by the SPSS program. So in finding that French was the primary language that was spoken, there were the other two languages, competing languages, were Spanish and English, but as said before, French, was the primary language that was spoken. And so in interpreting this information, people a lot of times fail to realize that because the context of all of this is Louisiana, going back a bit historically, we have the Louisiana Purchase that was initiated. So that this area of land was initially occupied by the French. And so it would only make sense that, there's a pre-existing French culture that was there. So when slaves were brought into Louisiana, a lot of times, as we historically know to be true, their history and their culture a lot of times was stripped from them. They were provided with a new culture. In this situation, in this circumstance, this new culture being French culture in general. So that is what kind of validates and substantiates the fact that French was the primary language that was being spoken. Now moving on to my next variable, which was sex or gender, primary sex or gender of slaves in Louisiana. The primary gender that we found, according to the data that was presented in the database, was that the primary gender that was in Louisiana at the time was male slaves. And so when we break this down and we go into the interpretive discussion, it seems pretty evident that in the industry of slavery, you make an initial investment on the behalf, and this is from the perspective of the slave buyers and slave owners. You make an initial purchase, and after making this purchase, you want your return. So you have a predominant population of males, because that they can do the work, that can produce the crops, they can do the agricultural labor, they can produce the labor that can in turn provide you with the initial principal investment that you invested into securing slaves that can be resecured by their labor that they have provided and the crops that you've received as a result of the labor, so you can make that money back. Now, it should be noted that there is not a great disparity in comparing the demographic of men and women. And I in rationalizing a proper business module, it would only make sense that you would want to have longevity to the investment that you initially made. And that's why you have a close number of women following, because they can in turn bear children, and in bearing those children, you now have established a pool of laborers, and almost to a certain degree, almost being unlimited in nature. So the next variable that I decided to review was racial demographic of slaves. And as most would have assumed, blacks were the primary race that made up the slave demographic in Louisiana at the time. Now, something that I did find to be interesting in, doing my interpretive discussion was that the quadroon and the octoroon were so very low. And this is a time where you have blacks and whites that are reproducing, and so there is a lot of intermingling, a lot of interracial reproduction. And because there was a status quo in a societal norm that placed blacks on the bottom of the totem pole, I rationalized that the reason why we have quadroon and octoroon demographics, so the reason why those numbers are so low is because it was not beneficial for them to present themselves as such. And in the case that you weren't mulatto and apparently mixed with black, it would have not made any sense for you to have not attempted to do away with your blackness or your black ancestry in order to sustain a proper seat in a social hierarchy that placed blacks on the bottom. So that was just a bit of food for thought in regards to race. My next variable was the runaway status of slaves. And so, interestingly enough, 94.92% of slaves were labeled as runaways. And then you had another additional 3.29% that were individuals that consorted with runaways, and then a 1.79% that complained about runaways. This is interesting because it just goes to explain and show that, being a runaway was not something that was uncommon, and that black people as a whole and these black slaves were doing everything that they could to try and escape their unfortunate circumstances. Expanding a bit more in the interpretive discussion, I think that it would obviously come to mind, if you were a slave, why would you complain about being a runaway? And I think that sometimes there's almost to a certain degree a bit of Stockholm syndrome that can present itself in the case of any situation where you're captured by another group of people. And so I feel that in light of understanding what that Stockholm syndrome entails, I think that had an effect as well. Not to mention that historically it was well known that the white slave owners made it quite apparent that there were severe consequences for being a runaway, and in the case that you were a runaway, it may not have been worth it to attempt to run away in light of in understanding what the potential consequences could have been. So that's just a bit of background information, a bit of rationale to explain why these numbers and these demographics look the way they do. Finally, we have this skill group. So the values of this variable were agricultural skills, domestic skills, security skills, fish and hunting skills, horse, cattle, leather and meat skills, forestry, lumber skills, land transport skills, water transport skills, industry skills, marketing skills, craft skills, and healthcare skills. And this is in reference to the slaves. Within the context of this variable, it was interesting in that, you know, it stereotypically is assumed that you would see a high demographic of agriculturally based skilled slaves. However, we found through the database that domestic skill set was more prominent in Louisiana, and that would make sense just in understanding the geography of Louisiana, and that there's a lot of swampland in Louisiana, and so it may not necessarily be the most appropriate to cultivate agriculture in general. So that it would make sense as to why, you know, domestic skill set was more needed and more prominent in Louisiana at the time. The next following is agriculture, because despite the fact that Louisiana was surrounded by a lot of swampland, that does not completely negate the Louisiana's ability to have its hands in agriculture. The following agriculture, we have the crafts. Excuse me, I misspoken. We have the crafts at 22.87%, and then that's followed by the agriculture. So that even goes to show you that much more how something that we would stereotypically assume would be the case in regards to being, you know, like what would be the most prominent skill set to have, how non-prominent that was when you have a domestic skill set as well as a crafting skill set that is more predominant than an agricultural skill set in the context of slavery. And that just goes to show you a bit about the Louisianian culture, as well as goes to talk a bit on the geography and how that played a part in just the day-to-day life for a slave in Louisiana. All in all, my conclusion about all of this information was that the database proved to be very much insightful in providing a bit of insight in the daily lives of slaves in Louisiana throughout that time from 1719 to 1820. And I think that is it for this presentation. Thank you for your time. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Have a great day.